I didn't tell anybody. I just started doing it. Like, I just knew that I had to write this book. And I knew that writing the book was the way through.
You took a part-time job at Trader Joe's, one of my favorite stores. Do you want to talk about how that transition came about and
Sure.
what happened?
I think whenever like you leave something that's your identity, since I was little, I always, was talking into a hairbrush. And so I've actually discovered, I always thought that was an actress, or eventually I thought it was a filmmaker. And lately I've realized I want to be a talk show host, right? And so, you wake up to that in your 50s and you're like, oh my God. And it's all these transitions we have to go to. And I like to call it like the breaking down of the ego self, right? To really get under what it is you really want to do. And I had come back to Los Angeles, gotten divorced, and had 2 small kids, and didn't want to go back in the movie business. I didn't want to go back and be like a production assistant. I had been there, done that. And I felt I would probably have to start in the beginning again. And to me, just getting a job at Trader Joe's just seemed like it's like somewhere safe for 8 hours to just be a worker among workers, which I really felt I needed to do. I honestly did not 100% need the money. My ex-husband was working. But that $11 an hour, I had not made a paycheck in a little while. And that $11 an hour was like really special to me. Oh, sorry. I remember when the manager, they had reviews. I've never been reviewed in my life. I've always been my own boss. And he took me outside and he said, Kim, the one big note we have for you is it's time for you to step up to your true potential. And I just started sobbing on a bench in Westwood. And I think he was like, oh my God, because it was so true that this guy had seen this in me, And he was like, okay, well, we're going to give you your 30-cent raise. I was like, thank you so much. And it just really made me see how I'd always been kind of hiding in the shadows.
So from having retail jobs myself, you interact with so many people. Some are wonderful, some maybe not so much, but there's always interesting characters. Were you watching some of the patrons come in, even though you were busy working, I'm sure, but
oh, yeah.
One eye was like, that would make a great character right there.
I didn't really think of it as like, because I was having an experience on such a personal level. Like, I'm sure in my writing, because I still write. I write all the time. But I think that those, they come, you remember them. But at the moment, I wasn't like, oh, that's a good character. Like, versus when I was in the film business, I was always like that. But now I was just having the experience with people. It was almost freeing. It was like I wasn't for anything. It was just to have the experience. And the people that I worked with, there was a guy who was he had been a convict. And we commiserated over tattoos, and I went to his tattoo guy. And there was like a 2 guys that were married, and like I got to know them. And so just to getting to know, there was another worker who had lost a baby at like 6 months, and we would hug every morning. Nobody needed to say anything. We were just like 2 people trying to process. And so there was a lot of that beautiful energy in that store. And then there were the people that would come in. There were the moms who were going to kids went to the same school as my kid down the street. And they would come in and they would like kind of corner me, and they'd be like desperate to get divorced, but they didn't know if they could financially support themselves. So they wanted to know how I did it. I'm like, I'm not financially supporting myself yet on Trader Joe's, but here, you got to make the leap, and you got to know, you got to figure it out. And they were just so fascinated by my courage to work there. And there were some very self-entitled people. My daughters love this story. There was a woman who came in. You could do what's called carry-out service, where you don't really have to have a reason. You don't have to be handicapped or anything. You can just demand carry-out service, right? And this woman demanded the carryout service. And as I'm pushing her cart, she turns around and looks at me and she goes, "Run!" And I was like, every East Coast punky part of me was just like, I am going to tell this woman where to put it. And so instead I just slowed down and I just got the cart there. And I walk back in, and two of my friends that work there were just sort of waiting for me, and they look at and they go, "So how did that go?" And I was like, "Oh my God, you guys didn't warn me." And they're like, "Oh my God, we can't stand that woman." And it was like, she does that to everybody. She's
Wow.
like, we are there for her,
Sure.
you know? And then there was a man who got racially, verbally abusive with an Iranian woman. And it was like, she wasn't moving fast enough. This is like the Trader Joe's I worked at. We would have these peak hours where every register, all 8, would be full. And you'd just be so stressed. And so then for something explosive to happen at your station was like, it was just, it puts you into like a state of shock. And he said something about like, learn how to use your card. And he called her a slur name. And she just turns around and she's like, I'm a MD. And they just started going at it. And the manager had to come over. And we had some intense stuff.
So at that time, had you been writing your memoir, or that
I
was
had
yet to
not
come?
even come to terms with, I don't think I had even had the dream about the sexual abuse yet. So the memoir is about waking up and realizing that I had been sexually abused for most of my childhood. So I had not woken to that yet. I think that was 1 year after.
And so with dreams, you'd always been empathic, so you've always been very sensitive to picking up.
I didn't know I was until in the last 6 years. Yeah, I've really stepped into that. I probably have been my whole life. It's just, you can suppress that stuff and just not even know what that is until you start kind of being in circles with people that are empathic, that are intuitive, that start to tell you you're psychic. You start to see energy move in the direction in which your thoughts are empowering it. And so I do believe abuse survivors have an extra dose of that because of the disassociation.
Right, and having to be hyper aware of their surroundings.
Yeah, for survival, right.
So at what point did you think about writing what happened? Did people talk you out of it?
I didn't tell anybody. I just started doing it. Like, I just knew that I had to write this book. And I knew that writing the book was the way through, which is what I tell a lot of my book clients. It's like, just write the story, just work your way through it, just get that first draft down, because what you're going to then share to the reader who needs you, that'll come out in that second draft once you get it all down. So I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And then later just kind of readjusted it to like some of the anger or some stuff that was a little bit too journally I took out just to really, I wanted to put it into categories for people, like explaining how sexual abuse affects every area of your life. Sexuality, spirituality, capacity to make money, masculine and feminine energy, everything. It somehow skews your perception in all those areas. And so I just kind of broke it down by the way I saw my life having been dictated about with the abuse without even really knowing that's what was happening.
Did you confront the person?
He was dead.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Forgive me if this is too personal, and we can stop if it is. Did you talk to other people that may have been around at that time?
I did. Part of the process was I called my mom because it was my dad, and received a big dose of, I didn't know there. And then called my cousin, so I've been close with growing up. And actually I called not both, I actually only called one of the 3 cousins who I'm more close to. And he was just so sympathetic and devastated. And nobody denied it. Told my one aunt, his mom, and tried to tell my sister. She didn't want to hear it. It's just so interesting, your family, like who will, my teenage daughter, who's now 15 and a half, I'm not going to beat myself up about it, but I did tell her fairly young. I think she was 12 or 13, as old as my current 12-year-old is now, who knows nothing. And I think because she was the firstborn, it was sort of like you look at them as more ready to handle it. She came to a book signing and she went through a lot of fear for a little while about the legacy of our family. She was afraid of like how it was going to be carried down, even though we've already broken the legacy. There's no abuse in our structure. So it's one of those things I learned, like we need to empower our children, but it's still a very scary subject for young people.
Can you talk about making decisions from high self-esteem versus low self-esteem?
Sure. I think now the decisions that I make are, really looking at like what I want as in the bigger picture versus the like everything used to be so important day to day, like the outcome of what, the voices in my head and what they would say, like, oh, you didn't do that right, or you didn't make enough money, or that person's not happy, or I can't change anybody's opinion. I can't make anybody happy, and I can't necessarily make anybody sad unless I've done something erroneous, which I could apologize for. But the higher self-esteem is definitely from that place of more thinking, I'm good. Like I've got this. Like I'm on the higher ground. Like I know where I'm going. Like the world, everything that I want is already available to me. Versus before, and this was a lot in the movie business, just a lot of just financial chaos, fearing being, criticized or just not being enough, I don't feel that way now.
And do you think a large part of it has to do with the dream and sort of coming clean with your past, even though it was no fault of your own, but just realizing what happened and what you had suppressed?
Oh, yeah. I think when you've been abused, there's a natural feeling that you're damaged goods and that like you're dirty, right? And especially if you haven't faced it, you just are like confused why you feel different, inside. And a lot of abuse survivors turn to drugs and alcohol to just because it's just there's something wrong, but they don't know what it is, right? So you're in the unknown where for some people, I mean, even now the unknown can be like, oh my God, but like you're in the unknown and it's like, it's almost like you're dying. It's that painful, right? Because you're untethered to something, right? Like you might not be tethered to the abuser anymore, but you're and there, if you don't have faith, then you're not tethered there. So drugs and alcohol are a great way for you to feel powerful because you're making a decision to do something. I'm going to get messed up and I'm going to be messed up. And that's a clear-cut decision and outcome where everything else really involves other people.
And you can also hang out with other people like-minded
that want to do it too.
Right.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
It's a very social thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In my 30s, I hung out with just terrible people that did all sorts of drugs. And I don't know if they had any abuse in their history. It was like, oh, we're filmmakers. That's what filmmakers do. They do a lot of drugs. And then it just doesn't work anymore. A comedian, I mean, when I moved to LA and in my 30s, like when I first got this whole thing going in LA, there were a lot of just people that were doing a lot of drugs.
Do you think that's why the Trader Joe's experience was also, because you felt you could just be yourself with the workers, whereas with the moms group, you had to be
something, right?
You couldn't. You didn't want to scare a mom,
right. With who I really was, right?
They could be the same way, but they didn't want to have that out
go there. It's true. At Trader Joe's, we were just all a bunch of misfits. It was so true, and I feel most comfortable. I'm someone that can kind of get along with everybody. But I'm always going to have a little bit of like a I like people with a little bit more of like a edge. That think kind of like we can laugh about the way we think and it's a little nutty and we don't have to be too apologetic because life is just life. And yeah, I don't do well with a lot of like superficial relationships.
And were you like that before the memoir? Or that's
Yes,
helped
but
you?
in a very angry way. So there was a lot of anger, like, why am I feeling like this all the time? There's a lot of yelling. I have a whole section in the book where I talk about the rage and how you're just constantly just yelling at people and you don't know why and you don't know what's behind all that rage, right? And movies were a great place for that because, again, it was justified. I'm painting such a horrible picture of the movie business. I loved making movies, by the way, and there were a lot of beautiful people and I had a lot of great experiences. But for me, it was okay for you to scream at somebody. Where now I'm like, that's completely unacceptable. If I'm even snippy with someone on my team now, I apologize. I send them like a coffee card. Right. But maybe that, maybe it is. Maybe it is. I think it has to do with recovery from abuse. I think you do start to see and you do start to feel what it feels like. Hurt people hurt people. So if you're not hurt anymore, you're not really wanting to hurt anybody anymore. And then I think you start to evolve on the other side of like, well, if I'm not a hurt person, then who am I actually going to be? A girlfriend of mine wrote a TV show. And this was 7 years ago when I was just I had been substitute teaching and I'd written my book. I was starting to kind of get my feet going. And I don't think I'd even written my book yet, but I had come to terms with the abuse. And she asked me to produce a pilot. And I was like, I'm not going to produce a pilot. Like, I'm not going back into the business. And she's like, no, we're going to have a great time and I'll pay you. It'll be really fun. And I was like, okay. And I was I had stopped drinking. So I was clean as a whistle. And I was like, all right, it's worth it. And then someone said to me when the job was done, and we had a great time. And when the job was done, someone said to me, why don't you poll the people that worked for you and ask them what they thought of you? And I was like so moved that not a single person called me a yeller. No one said I was aggressive. They said when I came in the room, they knew help was here, that I made them laugh, that I was always the last one to leave. And I was like, what? And I knew that something big had changed in my life. And then I thought, I want to make a movie like this. It's the one thing I kind of wish, that I could make a movie as the new me, because I would show up on that film set very differently than I would have back then. I would have fun.